Good morning. It's 8 o'clock, so if you guys could take your seats, we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Barbara Bynum, and I'm one of the forum facilitators along with my friends Kathy Fevers and Phoebe Benzinger and Judy Ann Files. Hey, look at that timing! And we are so thankful that you showed up here this morning. We love putting these programs together. I put a few business cards around with form information. So if you're not on our email list, that's how you get on the list to get an email. If you know someone that you think is interested, passing that card up to them is a great way for them to get that information as well. So this morning we are joined by Montrose County Assessor Brad Hughes. He's been in that role since 2006 as our head assessor. He's been working for the county though, valuing land and buildings for much longer than that. He's going to tell you a little bit about his qualifications, and he's going to tell you why your valuation is going to be pretty high, I guess, when you get that in the mail. He's got a great presentation lined up for us this morning. As usual, hold your questions till the end, and I will be happy to pass the mic around. And I think we'll try and get everyone's questions in before we end promptly at 9 o'clock. So let's give Brad a warm welcome.
Thank you, Barbara, and thank you all for coming today. I appreciate the invite. I was telling Kathy I looked, and the last time I spoke in front of this group was 4/19 of 19, so it's been exactly 4 years since I've talked to you. And so a lot has changed since then. So we'll get started. I recognize a lot of you folks in the room here, but for those of you that don't know me, so I've been your assessor, like Barbara said. This is my 5th term since '06. I've spent 30 years doing this at 5 different Colorado counties. And this is by far the largest increase that I've seen in that 30 years. And so, this is pretty substantial what we have going on in Western Colorado and Montrose County right now. So really, I guess I want to let you know I'm qualified for this position. I've been doing this for quite a while. I know how it works, and you may not like what I have to tell you, but hopefully you understand it, and you feel a little more educated on how we come up with valuations and property taxes. So normally I would start a little video about the assessor's office, but I think today I'm going to skip on that. That's something that's on my website. It pretty much says what an assessor does. Basically, what the assessor does is we set the valuations for all of the properties in the county, all classes of property, everything from residential, commercial, business, personal property. Once we set those valuations, we provide those values to the taxing entities. The taxing entities use that assessed valuation in order to determine what their mill levies are going to be and what their revenue is going to be. So that's ultimately the primary role of the assessor, is to set market values so that the taxing entities have an evaluation to set their mill levies off of to collect their revenue. The assessor does other functions as well, such as, obviously we keep track of all the ownership of the property through deeds, and we do that as well. But the primary function is to really set that base. Once I build a tax roll, I provide it to the treasurer's office, and Rosemary will collect your property taxes. Okay? Then she will take those taxes. The county obviously gets a portion of that. The school districts, all the special districts get that money. So that's pretty much what the assessor does. But sometime go look at that website, at my website, and watch that video. It's about 5 minutes. It gives a little more detail. So before we can really talk about what's happening to our valuations, you have to understand how property taxes are calculated. And actually, it's a very simple formula, right? You take your market value multiplied by a statewide assessment rate to get an assessed value multiplied by a mill levy equals your taxes, okay? So that's there's 3 components, right? The assessor's office, we set the valuations, right? The treasurer, they collect the taxes. It's the taxing entities that actually set your taxes, right? The legislature, they set the assessment rates for the entire state. The assessment rate is the percentage of your value that you pay taxes on, okay? So you don't pay taxes on 100% of your market value. You pay it on a fraction of your valuation. So another key that you have to understand is that these are not current market values to date, right? When we set these new valuations for residential properties, we use sales January 1 of 21 through June 30th of 22, so that 18-month window, right? Right after COVID, when prices went up, people started moving, and the market really took off. We have not used any of the sales that have occurred since last summer to today. Those will be used in the 25 reappraisal. Okay, so for commercial property, we use a 2-year window, 24-month, July of 20 through June 30th of 22. That's just so we can get more sales, right? We can have more data to set the valuations because there's a lot fewer commercial sales. So this next graph, it kind of shows where the assessments are in relationship to market value. Okay, so this green line, those are median sale prices since 2001. The median valuations, that's the assessor's values, right? We're always 2 years behind. And so, for example, the taxes that you just got done paying, right? That was the 22 tax year, but it was using a 2020 level of value. Okay, so right here in 2020, I mean, the market's here, and we were actually, your assessments were right here, right? And so we're always 2 years behind. Now, the only time that it changes is if you recall back in 2008 when the market kind of crashed, this market values were going down, but we had to still use these old sales when it was still going up. And so this right here, our assessments were higher than market value, right? But ever since pretty much 2014, the market's always been higher. So you can't really go to our website, look at that valuation and say, boy, this is my market value as of today. That was your market value as of June 30th. 2020 is what's on there now. The new valuations that I'm going to give you is June 30th of 22. So we reassess every 2 years. So another key component to understand, especially when people see these new valuations, right, is if we're using that 18-month window and there were sales that occurred in January and in early 2021, well, that same sale is not going to sell for the same price that it did on June 30th of 22, right? Because the market is still going up. So all these sales, so let's say we have these 3 sales, 305, 345, and 400,000. Well, I mean, if someone comes into my office and says, well, you know, here's 3 sales in my neighborhood that occurred in the time frame, and they're between 3 and 400,000, my value should be 350. Well, that's really not accurate, right? Because we're setting our valuation as of this date here. And so what we have to do is we have to analyze the market and see what kind of appreciation on a monthly basis was occurring over that time period. So we time adjust these sales, right? So that 305 sale gets a 31% adjustment, right? And so it's now basically 400,000. This sale that's sold September of 21, that gets a 16% adjustment. This 1.83% per month, that was the actual adjustment that occurred in the city of Montrose. That was the market appreciation per month. So now when we set valuations, we have 3 sales all at 400,000, right? And so we have a confidence level that the value on those properties should be right at 400,000 because we've taken into consideration time. So that's kind of a key concept. When you're looking at sales on the assessor's website or, you know, some other resources I'm going to tell you. Yes, ma'am.
So when I look at this, but I'm in an older neighborhood, and all the sales that occurred are all remodeled and higher end, and mine is not, but then I fall under their pricing, how is that accounted for?
I'll tell you what, why don't you hold that question, and at the end, we'll go into that, and I'll explain that in more detail for you, okay?
Thank you.
Sure. So that's one critical factor, and the reason that it's so critical is that we've never seen time adjustments like this. Now this is, I don't expect you to understand this graph. I guess what I just wanted to demonstrate to you here is that this is the city of Montrose improved properties, so that means residential improved properties. And this green line are sales ratios, okay? A sales ratio is the assessor's value divided by the sale price, right? If the assessor's value is 110,000 and the sale price is 100,000, it's a 110 ratio. If the assessor's value is 90,000 and the sale price is 100,000, it's a 0.90 ratio, right? And so, you know, what we're trying to achieve is 1, where our valuations divided by the sale price equal 1. That's how we actually measure statistically where our values are. And so you can see over time that in 2020, our values were 1 ratio. And then as time continues on, obviously our ratio is lowering. That means that values are going up in comparison to our prior values. And so when we apply this time adjustment, that 1.83% a month, what that does, that flattens this line out, right? And so when that flattens it out, well, that tells me that we're 70 or 30% undervalued, right? Because this is the time frame we're looking at right here, right? This June 30th date. We're using data that occurred prior than that, but our goal is to use data that's been time trended up to a June 30th, 22 level of value. So that's the actual statistical side of it. And this chart is just a demonstration as well, right? I mean, we have vacant and improved properties, right? So there was a time trend in both, right? Normally it's usually improved properties, but vacant land went up tremendously this last time. You're going to see that. Vacant land in Econ, the city of Montrose is Econ 1, okay? So it had a 2% on vacant land and basically a 1.8% on improved. Out in the county, the vacant land was even more. The first half of 2020, vacant land was at 5% a month increasing. And then it slowed down to 2%, and then it increased again to 3.5%. So statistically, we can find out what that trend line is doing and apply that to those sales. Another big one was commercial. We've really never had a big 1.22% per month on commercial properties. If you think about that, over a 2-year period, at 1.22% a month, I mean, that's a substantial increase in market conditions for commercial property. And if all that doesn't really make sense to you, and you want me to simplify what a market adjustment is, this is Bear Creek subdivision, okay? Very similar homes. It's not like they've changed the quality of the homes, the size of the homes. But look at the price per square foot. You know, back in 2020 and 2021, it was right around $175, $200 a square foot for those homes, right? By the end of the reappraisal, when we were setting values here, it was $275 a square foot, right? So that $100 a square foot occurred in that 18-month window. And so that's why valuations have increased. That's what the sale prices have done. And we'll talk about why some of those reasons are. So we've kind of talked a little bit about, remember our formula, market value times assessment rates equals assessed value times mill levy equals taxes. So let's talk about the assessment rates next. So last time I gave this presentation, we were still under the Gallagher Amendment, right? Where everything was 29% of market value, and the residential assessment rate kept being ratcheted down because market values across the state of residential property were increasing. Well, the voters repealed the Gallagher Amendment in 2020. So now the legislature is tasked with assigning assessment rates. So for 2023, they did lower your assessment rates slightly, okay? You know, let's look at residential. That's what everyone in here mostly has. There's some commercial property owners as well, but you know, your assessment rate is 6.95 down to 6.765, basically a 3% reduction. So is that going to solve your problem? No, right? I mean, if you have a 50% increase in your market value and a 3% reduction in your assessment rate, well, you still have a 47% increase, right? I mean, it's something, but that little change right there supposedly is, and another adjustment, is saving the taxpayers $700 billion this year across the state. So I just want to show this one. There was an attempt, but it's pretty small. The other thing that happened for 23 is everyone will get a $15,000 actual value reduction on their residence for one time, 1 year only, right? And for commercial properties, $30,000 per improved commercial property. And I've got an example of how taxes are calculated, and I'll show you that adjustment. These numbers are not going to be on the notice of valuation you receive from my office. These will be done before we actually create the tax bills in December of 23. Vacant land, industrial properties do not get this exemption. So the last component of your taxes is the mill levy. And a mill levy is just a multiplier, okay? It means that 1 mill, you know, is $1 for each $1,000 of assessed value. And so really, you know, like for example, Telluride, their values are so high, their mill levies are low, right? If you go to a depressed area where the values are low, the mill levies are higher. It's just a multiplier in order to get a certain amount of revenue. So in Montrose County, 68 mills is the average mill. So that means you're paying $68 for each $1,000 of assessed value. And in Montrose County, we have 34 individual taxing jurisdictions. I think you know the big ones, right? The county, the school districts, the fire district, the library district, but then there's water districts and cemetery districts. Each property is where it's geographically located, pays into those districts, right? So when you get your tax statement, you see what tax areas you pay into on a line item basis. And there's 101 unique locations, so there's that many tax areas in Montrose County, right? That's overlapping districts where boundaries lie, and you pay the ones that your property sits within. All right, so now we've had our refresher, right? Everybody's confident and we feel like they know how to do taxes, right? Okay, so let's do a sample calculation, right? Using those figures that we talked about. So let's say we had a property last time that was valued at June 20 level of value at $300,000. With the old assessment rate, the taxes would have been about $1,418, okay? So now you're gonna get this new valuation. That's the median and average increase, 47%. So that's gonna go from $300,000 to $441,000. Well, remember I said we're gonna get a $15,000 reduction? You apply that, you're down to $426,000. You multiply that by your new 23 assessment rate, your taxes are $1,960. So what that's telling me is that even though we increased the valuation 47%, with those two adjustments to the assessment rate and the exemption, that's still a 38% increase in your taxes if the mill levy does not get lowered. And we'll talk about that later too, okay? But if the mill levy stayed the same, that would be a typical increase in your property taxes would be 38%. So now let's get into some of the numbers. And I think this kind of tells it right here is, let's look at residential. We had some big increases kind of back in '06, and then things slowed down, and we had, in 12, we were using the data. There was a decrease in value because we were finally using the data from the properties that sold in distress after the crash of '08. And so values went down, and then you can see the last 3 cycles, they went up 15 and 19 and 18%. So those are pretty steady increases over a 2-year period. But then look at this here. This is our new increase, 47%. Right? Commercial, 32, vacant land is 60. The vacant land, that's deceiving because that's the median value. I know a lot of vacant land that went up 100%. We just had to double the values. A lot of vacant land. This is all based on sales, right? So this is what's going on in our market right now. This is basically the same kind of data, but it's just showing the change. And I think the key on this slide is, if you look at our vacant land values back in June of '08, we got back to in 2020, we got back to our '08 valuations. Right? Vacant land took a tremendous decrease. Now it's finally up, and now you can see it's just skyrocketed. There was a time those lots, let's just use a lot in Spring Creek, was selling for $100,000 back in '08. Then they went down, all the way down to like $20,000. Now they're back up to $140,000. I mean, there's been a huge swing in vacant land in Montrose County. So you're probably wondering, is this going on everywhere? Well, it's statewide, and this week I put together a press release for all the Western Colorado assessors, right? And so I got their data. And you can see we're not alone. All of Western Colorado, these are the median changes in their residential and commercial valuations. And so, Montrose County is right about in the middle, right? We're kind of the average, right? The overall is 45, 46%, we're at 47. I mean, Uray County 66, San Miguel 58. I mean, those are some substantial increases compared to ours, but they're all high across all of Western Colorado. So it's not just us. Unfortunately, all of Western Colorado has been discovered by other folks. They're moving here. I don't expect you to read that. What I want to get across here is that I would hope that informed, educated people have been knowing this is coming, okay? These are articles in the Daily Press and the Colorado Sun. Home prices skyrocketed in 2021. Colorado's taxable home values could skyrocket in 23. County housing prices continue to soar in 22, right? I mean, hopefully this is not new information for anyone. That this stuff has been getting out and you're prepared for some of this. So that leads me to, well, where do we stand in Colorado compared to the rest of the country for property taxes? This graph's not as good, but you can see the lighter the color, the lower the effective property tax rate. So Colorado's actually pretty low. I think the next graph is better. So Colorado has the 3rd lowest residential property taxes in the country. Effective tax rate, right? And let me explain that. On an average home, which is basically $397,000, the taxes are $2,017. So that's basically 0.5% of your value you pay in taxes. So it's hard to measure, right? Because like Alabama, theirs is lower than ours, but their median value is only $157,000, right? So it's hard to really compare where Colorado stands unless you really, the dollar amount that you pay is probably more than a lot of these states. annually, but it's because your valuation is that much higher. I don't know if that makes you feel any better or not. So, you know, this is a tool that will be, it's on my website right now, but if you go look at your property, it says link to residential sales, and it'll give you a screen similar to this. You put your property in, and it'll show you the sales that were used to set the valuations in your neighborhood. Right? And I think instead of me giving you spreadsheets where you try and, you know, look at the address and kind of try and figure out where that is and how that's sold, this actually will have a photograph of the sale, what the time-adjusted sale price is, in a map to show you where what properties in your area sold to set your valuations. So I'd recommend that everyone uses that tool, and at least you'll see what's going on in your area. So I want to include a few other things that people might have questions on. So a lot of people did not get a tax bill this year on their manufactured home. So Senate Bill or House Bill 1223 exempted manufactured titled homes 28,000 or less. So that took 2,200 mobile homes off the tax roll last year. That means those folks no longer are paying taxes on those. But for 23, 300 of those went back on the tax roll because their valuation increased above that 28,000 threshold. So if you or you know someone that didn't get a tax bill, you have an idea why. If you live in a manufactured home, basically an older manufactured home. So you're probably wondering, I told you what the legislature did regarding assessment rates in that $15,000 and $30,000 reduction. So those were for last session, right? They're effective for this session. They're still in session as we speak right now. And so there have been two bills related to property tax. So there was a bill that was sponsored by a former assessor that's now a legislator. And this bill would have essentially suspended these assessments, right? We just would not have done this reappraisal. Everybody would have kept their original valuation, and we would have done a reappraisal in 25. Now, that's a short-term solution, right? Because depending on what values do then you could really have some increases. But that bill was killed, and so that's off the table. We're still with our new values. The second thing that they did, and this is, my understanding is this probably will pass, this Senate Bill 108. So it allows taxing entities to temporarily reduce their mill levies, and they can raise them back up without violating Tabor at a future date. So basically, it allows them to take a temporary tax credit to lower their levies, and then when values flatten out or if values decline, they can raise those levies back up. So really, that's going to be kind of a key for folks when these taxing entities start having their budget hearings in the fall. And they're going to get these large increase in assessed values. It's going to be up to the taxpayers to talk to their entities and find out either one of two things. What are you going to do with that additional revenue? Or are you going to temporarily lower your mill levy? This last one I'm concerned about, right? There's still 3 weeks left in the session. That doesn't mean that the last day the legislature can't do something crazy and everything I've told you is out the window for this year, right? I mean, it's happened before. So I guess at this point in time, this is what's going on, but something could always happen. So a lot of people ask me, well, why are these values going up like this? And I'm sure there's a lot more reasons, but there's strong demand for real estate in Western Colorado. These increased building material costs have made the cost of new homes substantially higher. And when new homes go up, it's a principle of substitution. The older homes go up as well. Historically low mortgage rates, obviously they're starting to go up. So people ask, well, what is the market doing right now? if I run the sales data from June 30th, 22 to today, right? So everything that's after our time frame. Overall, I still get a median ratio of 1. That means values are flat. But I have looked at some neighborhoods, and some are continuing to go up, and others have actually went down. And so, there's pockets of up and down, but for the most part, values have stabilized, which I think that's probably a good thing. And I think those interest rates increasing are a lot of that cause. After COVID, there was a steady migration of people to Western Colorado. That's really the primary reason, right? When we see all these deeds coming through our office transferring ownership, they're really not local people moving around. They're from Metro Denver, they're from California, they're from Texas, they're from all over the country. And so, we're getting a lot of new people in our area. And basically, what I have on the bottom is Montrose County has been discovered and people are paying much higher prices for the opportunity to live here. That's really what's happened. All right, great. Thank you.
Duffy, you want to ask a question again?
I want to say the data is amazing, so thank you for providing that. Can we have access to those slides somewhere?
Yeah, I usually put this information on my website.
Okay, that would be amazing because I'd love to share that. I think it's staggering, but it prepares people a few months in advance. So thank you. And so to go back to your formula and how we are looking at certain neighborhood, and as you know, a few opportunities came and people remodeled older neighborhood, and we have incentives from the city to really work on downtown with the redo district. So with these things happening, but I have not remodeled my home, let's say, hypothetically, then how does that affect my home value? Because then I pay the same amount of a home that is valued twice as much because of the improvements.
Well, there's one component we didn't talk about, right? I mean, how do we actually value these properties? And I think that's kind of key is obviously, let's stick with residential, right? So I'll have 3,300 residential sales in that 18-month window to set the valuation on 18,000 improved properties, right? So 3,000 sales, but I've got to set the value on 18,000 properties. And so what we'll do is, let's say in your area, we'll actually look at the sales that occurred. We'll look at the sales ratios. Obviously, when we get a permit for a remodel on a house, we'll increase the effective age. That'll increase the value. It's not going to be the same as yours. So if you have not renovated your home and all the others have, and we know that, you will have a lower valuation than those other properties.
So my question is, how do you know that?
Well, we get our data we actually physically go out to all new construction. We actually look at sales. If if obviously everything's selling for $200 a square foot in a neighborhood and one comes in at 125, we're going to either, is that a bad sale or is there something wrong with that property? We'll investigate that. We use MLS because we can see the interior of these properties and see what the condition is and the status of them. So we have a lot of sources for that. But basically, we take those sales in your neighborhood and we try to mirror those sales in our valuation model. And once we've got a close statistical match, the closest we can get, then we apply that to all the unsold properties as well. Right? And so that's actually how we set the values. We value to the sales, and then we apply that same factor to everybody else. So that way, whether your property's sold or not, you're increasing at the same rate. Does that help you, ma'am?
Sorry.
Hi there. How do new properties that aren't getting sold but built find their way into these valuations?
New properties, it's the same way, right? I mean, if typically, whether it's out in the county or whether it's a new subdivision, I mean, we will have sales on new properties, right? And so we will model those. And even if you don't have a sale, that's what I'm saying is we will have sales of, let's say, 15–20% of the new properties. So we know what properties are selling for per square foot. We can apply that to the unsold properties as well.
Thank you for your presentation, Brad. That was really informative. So if I'm a student at Montrose High School or Olathe High School, and when you retire, I want to be the county assessor, what should I study in college and what skills should I get? I noticed you said you had an economics degree. Can you talk a little bit more about how you got to your career?
Well, nobody strives to become an assessor. You know, I do have 2 appraiser openings coming up, so you start as an appraiser and you work your way up from the bottom. That's the best way, okay?
Great presentation, Brad. So in my view, the assessment rate is kind of like the legislative gas pedal, you know, to see how fast the car is going. And when that runs into something like Tabor, how are those two reconciled?
Well, you're right, Jim. In a perfect world, right, when values went up this high, the legislature would have said, hey, we're gonna take the gas off and we're gonna lower these assessment rates in order so that there's not this historical increase, right? And they probably could have done that. But you gotta remember that the legislature, you only pay a third, the biggest portion of your property tax bill is to the schools, okay? And that's still only, let's say, 40% of the school's funding. And so the state has to backfill the other 60% of the school funding. And so, you know, that's the whole reason why the legislature wants the local citizens to pay a good percentage of that school funding, because if they don't, and they lower, let's say they lowered the assessment rates down to 3, right? Then that means that's that much money, that's that much more money they have to backfill, right? And it takes money from other projects of the state. So I don't know if I'm answering your question, Jim.
Well, you know, if government is collecting too much money, right, it runs into Tabor, right?
Well, I mean, the problem is this, is that the schools are kind of their own issue. Look, we're not going to get into that. That's very complicated. But the county, for example, they are Tabor restricted. So what will happen is Montrose County will do a refund. My understanding is they'll do a refund next year, right? But a lot of the taxing jurisdictions have lifted their Tabor restrictions, right? And so, you know, I'm not going to pick on districts, but let's just take a couple of districts that the last several years, even though we've had increasing values, have not lowered their levy, right? I believe the rec district and the library district, they've been at their same levies for the last several periods. Well, you know, I don't know if they must be Tabor restricted.
Jenkins, are you here right now?
Sorry.
Okay. But I think Tabor's not really doing what it was designed for, because so many taxing entities have voted to get out from underneath those Tabor restrictions. Montrose County has not, but the rest of them have.
Is getting out of those Tabor restrictions the same thing as being debruced? Is that what that means?
Yes, that's a similar
Okay,
thing.
so the school district and the rec district I can speak to as being debruced, we would set that mill every fall and sometimes reduce it and sometimes increase it without that Tabor restriction.
Brad, I think one of the items in response to the question over here, there is an appeals process. Could you explain that to the folks?
Absolutely. So when you get that notice of valuation, it's going to show your 2020 level of value, your 22 level of value, and it's going to be a tremendous increase, right? We've already talked about that. So you do have the right to appeal that valuation. Maybe like this lady had discussed with me, maybe there's a condition issue with that property. Maybe there's something we don't know about that property. Those are the ones that we will probably look at. if you just come in and say, well, my taxes are too high, you know, there's nothing I can do about that. I mean, we're looking at the valuation. So I'm going to recommend that you look at comparable sales. You have to look at the time-adjusted prices, not the regular sale prices. And if you see something that doesn't make sense, I mean, think about it. We're setting values to the median value, median sales ratio. So there's going to be a lot of sales that are higher and a lot of sales that are lower, right? When I set the value in the middle, those are the properties we might want to take a closer look at. But yeah, you have between May 1 and June 8th this year to appeal your valuation. You can email your data in, you can come in the office and talk to an appraiser, you can mail in your information, whatever's convenient for you. Does that answer your question, Ben?
I have a question. With property taxes going up so much, do you anticipate once all of us get our bills, more people will put their houses on the market? Or do you anticipate, because of higher taxes, do you anticipate the market will stay as strong as it is? And that would not be the case. That's my first question.
Well, I think the problem is this, right? If you put your property on the market, are you going to really be able to go anywhere else in Western Colorado if you want to stay here? Yeah, you can probably go back to Alabama where the prices are lower, right? But I mean, that's the problem, right? Is no one, everybody's values went up and they can sell their property for more, but they can't replace it somewhere else. You know, it's a difficult balance there, right? You can't really go to Delta anymore because the values are up in Delta, right? You might be able to go to Whitewater or some other areas like that where the market's a little lower, but I don't really see that. I don't know how to answer that anymore.
No, that's a good answer. My second question is, what do you consider the most challenging part of your job?
Well, 95% of the time, this is a wonderful job and I really enjoy doing it. Right? But a lot of times people don't want to be educated, they don't want to understand it, they just want to be upset. Right? And so I guess that would be the toughest part of the job.
I think someone up here has a question too. You good? Okay.
Back to the modular what do you call it, manufactured home?
Yes.
Exactly. So that's just the home itself, not the land?
Correct. That's just the title manufactured home.
Okay, so that if they own their own property, they're still paying
Correct.
tax on the land. But the home itself might be exempted.
If it's a title manufactured home, which most of those are sitting in the parks, right? I mean, a lot of people, if you have a manufactured home out in the county, I'm not saying that most of those have been purged to the land so that you can get financing on them, right? And those are not exempted because the valuation of the land in the purged manufactured home is going to be a lot higher than $28,000. What we saw was mostly older, pre-HUD and in 1980s single wides in these parks that got exempted. Does that answer your question?
I live in the county and I see a lot of custom homes being built. How do you come up with a valuation on a custom home?
So basically, when my appraisers go out and put a new home on for the first time, right, they get the building plans from either the city of Montrose or Montrose County. They'll add the square footage from the plans. They'll physically go out, photograph the property, look at all the amenities that go with that property, characteristics. There's anywhere from a class 0 to a class 6 quality of construction. And there's a lot that goes into that, but obviously our highest end homes, you know, they're typically over 4,000 square feet, most of them 5, 6, 7, 8,000 square feet. They have really high end finishes. They've got typically, minimum of 3-car garage. I mean, so there's a category that we classify these at, and then when we start analyzing the sales data, not only will we look at it by neighborhood location, but we'll look at it by quality of construction as well. So a custom home like that, if it has those amenities, should have a higher valuation than, for example, a tract home of similar size. Okay?
I own a home that's just north of a subdivision, and I call it the warehouse district. The values of the homes would be comparable to my home, but not the warehouse. And it's distinct. The warehouse makes those properties distinctly different than mine, which does not have a warehouse. Would you go further afield to comp my house with houses that are like mine, or would you still use the nearby comps from the warehouse district?
When you say warehouse district, I'm not following what you're talking about.
I mean, these houses that have large warehouses on their properties along
You
with
mean
the
a large
residents.
like a large pole barn or structure of some sort, shop?
$150,000 through $250,000 structures that hold motor homes and.
I see what you mean.
I mean, they're warehouses.
Right. Well, I mean, your valuation is broken down by the home itself, the land, and then any accessory buildings that go with that, right? And so for residential, we start with basically it's a cost analysis of what that would cost to build, and then we analyze sales to find out did it contribute. Maybe it contributes 80% of the cost of construction, because just because you build it and it costs you $100,000 doesn't mean when you resell it you're going to receive $100,000 for it, right? So we'll analyze what the contributory value of those secondary structures are, and we'll value those accordingly. So they will have a different value than you, because we will be adding an additional value of those shops or those pole barns or whatever structure is associated with that property.
These aren't pole barns. These are stick-built, either metal or frame construction that 6,000 to 8,000 square foot warehouses.
Are they for residential personal use?
Yes.
Yeah. Those ones go on that person's valuation model. If you go on our website and you take a look at their property, they'll have their home, and then they'll have an extra feature that is some sort of shop or some other classification, and there'll be a value for that. Yeah.
So my question quickly is, what is your preference? I am a real estate agent, and so when your bill is going to come out, I'm going to have a lot of questions on Delphine, give me an estimated value of my home, right? And as realtor, because obviously when you look at 3,000 sales in an area, but you have to assign 18,000 in that same area, you're not looking at each home individually, and I totally understand that. So would you rather I prevent this by already sending all my clients who purchased a home this year, let's say, or in the last 2 years, and I send them their evaluation so they can be ready for their increase, and they already have that information? Or would you rather I wait for them to request it? What's your preference to work with realtors like this? Because we get a lot of requests. When the bill comes, I'm the first one they call,
Sure.
right? What's your preference?
Well, I talked to a realtor group yesterday, okay, and we talked about that exact thing, right? Because people are going to go to their realtor and say, hey, my property can't be worth this. Can you give me some comparables in my neighborhood? Mm-hmm. And so you're going to run MLS comparables in their neighborhood in the time frame. But the problem is, what you give them, right, like that example I gave you, if you give them a sale for 300, 350, and 400, they're going to come to me and say, well, it should be valued at 350 in the middle. As a realtor, you need to take those MLS listings or those solds and probably see what the time-adjusted price is, right? And then you could give them comparables in their neighborhood so that we're all using the same data. Right, so that's what I would recommend, is you can go, when a property sells in MLS, you can go to my website, see what the time adjusted sale is, and say, yeah, this sold in early 21, it needs to be indexed for time, and so therefore it's not 300, it's 400,000, right? And then you look at our valuation, and if our valuation is with close to 400,000, you probably tell your client, well, you probably don't really have an appeal. Your property was probably worth that at that time. Right? If you come to a different conclusion, we've got 500 on the property, well then maybe then you submit that stuff as an appeal. Okay?
Thank you.
Sure.
Understanding that time adjustment is so key, because I don't think that was such a big deal before when prices were rising as quickly. I never realized that really you're trying to establish the price on that single date and not an average for those 18 months.
Absolutely. That's a key right there, Barbara, is, you can look at the data a lot of different ways, but you have to go to that point in time.
You might mention also Eagle Web. It doesn't show you the changes year to year, but people can at least look into a neighborhood and see what homes had sold for at the date that they did sell.
Yeah, you can do it a couple different ways, right? We're going to have residential sales on the website. We're going to have, if you go to Eagle Web, you can look at any property of your neighbors that you know have sold and see what that price was. Or you can use that other product that I was showing you if you want to see your property in relationship on a map to those sold properties. That's a good idea. Yes, ma'am.
Did someone else have a question? Coming up.
Could you hurry a little?
Thank you, Brad. So let's say you're in a subdivision and you have a lot and a house on it, and there's a vacant lot next to you, and you buy that lot. Is that assessed at a vacant value, or does it become part of your whole piece?
Well, that depends, okay? If you, what I always tell people is, let's say that you buy the adjacent property because you want to protect your views, or you want to put your detached garage on it or something like that. If you're using it in conjunction with that residence, and it's most likely to transfer with your property, then we have reclassified. So you get two lot values, but you get the residential assessment rate on the one that's being, let's say it's landscaped and irrigated with your lawn. But if you just buy it as an investment or something next to you, it really stays as vacant land.
It's amazing how much research your office does into these individual pieces of property.
Oh yeah, it's there's a lot that goes on that we're not even talking about, but every time someone subdivides land, right? We have to reassess that value. We have to reassign all those properties. So there's a lot to it.
You have a follow-up to that?
So the mill entities, recreational district, I know we vote on the school district, board, but do all these mill districts have elected boards? And if not, isn't that kind of like taxation without representation?
No, that they all have boards.
They do.
Yep.
Electable?
Yes, and in fact, Lindsay Riley is here. She is currently running the fire district and the rec district's election. Do you have additional information to add for people who live in those districts to be aware of that?
Well, the fire district has canceled their election. The rec district does have an election on May 2nd. There's going to be 4 candidates running for 3 spots. That election will be at Friendship Hall, and unless requested, you will not receive a mail ballot. That's a polling place election.
And yeah, those elected boards set that mill levy every fall.
Yeah.
How about the small ones, like the water districts? Who's setting their mill?
All those jurisdictions, they all have boards, right? But there's some boards like Colorado River Water that covers multiple counties. Lostock Park Water, Tri-County Water. I mean, there's a lot of little boards, but the problem, those are a pretty small amount of your taxes, right? I mean, the big ones are the county and the school are 66% of your property tax, right? And so that's just something to keep in mind. These little districts could lower their levy, but it's the county and the schools that make up the big portion of your tax bill, right? And I'm not real versed on the School Finance Act, but I don't believe that the school districts, they're not subject to that and they will not be lowering their levies. Actually, I know that the schools, they've actually been raising their levy by $1 million for the past several years.
So,
So I could
introduce
speak.
yourself, Richard.
Okay, so I'm Matt Jenkins. I'm the Public Information Officer for Montrose County School District. I'm responsible for communications, among other things. I used to be a teacher at Montrose High School, and I'm glad to work at all the schools now. So I could talk for, most of us in my organization could talk to school finance for a week and a half. It's pretty complicated. There actually was some reporting this morning that the legislature, as Brad mentioned, is getting close to the long bill, which has a school finance bill. Couple of key points I would point out. Much like Brad said, property taxes were toward like the third lowest in the nation for property taxes. We also are toward the third lowest for school finance. For the last 15 years, since the 2008 housing crisis, we've actually underfunded schools by around $10 billion due to the budget stabilization factor. And in a month or two, if these ladies, a couple of the ladies who put the forum on actually were school board members, so they could speak to some of this, and we would be glad to do a public presentation or meet individually with folks to understand school finance, because it is a little complicated, but also it's really important because a thriving economy, oftentimes is a product of your school district, your kids you're training to work in your industry and your small businesses. But long story short, it is complicated, but we need to do a better job funding schools. And the last point of order, I would say, Montrose County School District is among a handful of districts in the state of Colorado that has never passed a mill levy override. We have passed a couple of bonds in the past 30 years to build new school construction, but we've never passed a mill. And so we're kind of in the minority of that.
I could listen to an hour forum about school finance, but I don't know that everyone can. But if you think that's really interesting, let us forum folks know that you'd like to see that as an hour, because I don't want to make that call, because I think it's cool, but if you all don't come, it doesn't matter. Okay, I think we have time for one last question, and then we're going to.
The senior and veterans property tax exemption, how does this go into that whole dance of no levies and assessed values?
Well, fortunately, all of this doesn't affect that program, right? I mean, assuming that the legislature continues to fund those programs, the senior, and for those, I'm sure everyone knows about this. We send out notices twice a year, but if you're 65 years or older, you have owned and occupied your property for over 10 years, then you can qualify for a senior exemption, which is basically half of the first $200,000 in market value. And so for a lot of people, it's about a $500 reduction to their property tax. That should still be in play for this 23 tax year, payable in 24, right? I mean, we'll know in May whether that gets funded or not, but I don't know why it wouldn't, because they've been using the Tabor surplus to fund that program, and there's plenty of Tabor surplus this year, okay?
Okay, let's give
Thank
them a
you all.
big round of applause.